A single 14-foot Eclipse windmill could pump 2,000 gallons of water a day from a depth of 100 feet. That is roughly 8 tons of liquid mass moved by air alone. In 1880, cattle barons and Eastern investors dismissed these machines as useless toys and farmers' folly, believing that relying on the wind to secure $1 million investment was financial suicide. They were dead wrong. This technology didn't just water livestock, it terraformed the American West. Without the self-regulating windmill, 2 million acres of the high plains would have remained a desolate, uninhabitable desert, regardless of how many cowboys roamed them. We are told the West was won by the Colt revolver and the Winchester rifle. It wasn't. It was won by a gearbox that cost $80 and spun in the wind. The ledgers from the massive XIT ranch prove that the difference between bankruptcy and empire was not gunpowder, but hydraulic lift. July 15, 1885, the Texas Panhandle. The temperature is 104 degrees in the shade, but there is no shade. You are standing on the XIT ranch, a parcel of land so large it covers 10 counties, roughly the size of Connecticut. The horizon is a flat, shimmering line of heat haze. The wind is blowing at a steady 15 miles per hour, kicking up alkaline dust that coats the back of your throat and settles into the creases of your clothes. At your feet, the ground is cracked, baked into a ceramic hardness that rings when a horse's hoof strikes it. Yet, 300 feet below your boots, there is an ocean. This is the Ogallala Aquifer, a massive underground reservoir stretching from South Dakota to Texas, holding enough water to fill Lake Huron. But in 1885, without electricity and without engines, that water might as well be on the moon. To keep a herd of 10,000 cattle alive in this furnace, you need 150,000 gallons of water every single day. A healthy steer consumes 15 gallons daily. A nursing cow needs even more. If you rely on surface water here, you are gambling with millions of dollars of investors' money. The creeks are intermittent, flashing into torrents during storms and vanishing into mud cracks days later. The rivers are muddy trickles, alkaline and often poisonous with gypsum. The conventional method of the era for retrieving groundwater was manual labor or horse-driven pumps. A strong man working a hand pump with a standard 24-inch stroke can lift perhaps 500 gallons in a 10-hour shift before physical exhaustion sets in. To water the XIT herd manually, you would need an army of 300 men doing nothing but pumping handles from dawn until dusk. The payroll alone would bankrupt the operation in a month. This is the mathematics of survival that Hollywood westerns ignore. The cowboy myth focuses on the cattle drive, moving cows to water. But the new reality of the 1880s was fencing them in. And once you put up a fence, you have to bring the water to the cow. The silence of the plains is broken by a rhythmic metallic creak. High above, a wooden wheel, 10 feet in diameter, turns into the wind. It isn't the picturesque cloth-sailed mill of Holland, which requires a miller to be present constantly to furl the sails when the wind gets too high. This is a skeleton of wooden slats and cast iron. As the wind gusts to 30 miles per hour, the wheel doesn't shatter. It folds in on itself, reducing its surface area, surviving the gale. This is the governing mechanism, and it is the specific mechanical breakthrough that separates a toy from an industrial engine. A distinct stream of clear water pulses into a wooden tank. It flows at 5 gallons per minute, 24 hours a day, without a salary, without food, and without complaint. But the men watching it spin are still skeptical. They don't trust a machine they can't whip or threaten. The man responsible for that turning wheel was Daniel Halliday. He wasn't a cowboy, and he had never seen the Texas Panhandle. He was a Connecticut mechanic. In 1854, he solved the problem that had plagued wind power for 1,000 years: how to prevent the machine from destroying itself in a storm. The physics of wind are brutal. The power of the wind increases with the cube of its speed. A 20-mile-per-hour wind has 8 times the power of a 10-mile-per-hour wind. Without a governor, a windmill spinning in a sudden squall will spin until it flies apart, turning into shrapnel. Halliday's invention, the Halliday Standard, used centrifugal force. As the wheel spun faster, weights would fly outward, angling the wooden blades out of the wind, slowing the wheel down. It was a machine that thought for itself. But the technology needed a capitalist to scale it. Enter the Capital Syndicate, the group of investors who owned the XIT. They were a consortium of Chicago businessmen who weren't interested in the romance of the frontier. They were interested in yield. The scale of their problem was unprecedented. They had traded the funding and construction of the massive Texas State Capitol building in Austin for 3 million acres of panhandle land. It seemed like the deal of the century until the surveyors arrived. They found that the land was legally classified as waste because it lacked surface water. To make the land productive, to turn waste into assets, they needed to distribute cattle across the entire acreage, not just along the riverbanks. This required a grid. The plan called for a windmill every 4 miles. This detail, the 4-mile grid, becomes critical because it dictated the biology of the American cow. A steer will not walk more than 2 or 3 miles for water before it starts losing weight. They begin burning tallow, the very fat that the rancher intends to sell. If a cow has to walk 5 miles to water and 5 miles back, it is burning profit with every step. The windmill allowed ranchers to tighten that radius. It allowed them to convert the dry uplands, previously untouched, into prime grazing territory. The economic system driving this was the sudden demand for beef in the industrialized East and the United Kingdom. The refrigeration car had just been invented, meaning dead cattle could be shipped as meat rather than live animals. This changed the math. Volume mattered. The XIT and the King Ranch needed to support stocking densities that the natural landscape could not sustain. The windmill was the artificial lung of this system. By 1880, a standard windmill cost between $70 and $100 installed. That is roughly $2,500 in today's money. It seems expensive until you look at the labor ledger. A cowboy earned $30 a month plus board. A windmill paid for itself in saved labor in less than 3 months. The mechanism of the American windmill was deceptive in its simplicity, but it was a marvel of 19th century engineering. Unlike European mills, which required a miller to manually turn the cap into the wind, the American mill used a tail vane. The wind itself aimed the wheel. If the wind shifted 5 degrees north, the tail pushed the wheel 5 degrees north. It was automation before the word existed. Inside the gearbox, a crankshaft converted the rotary motion of the wheel into a vertical, reciprocating stroke, up and down. This rod went down the well casing, sometimes hundreds of feet, to a brass cylinder at the bottom. The lift capacity was determined by the size of the cylinder and the diameter of the wheel. A 10-foot wheel could lift water from 100 feet easily. For deeper wells, you needed a 12-foot or 14-foot wheel. The installation of these machines was a logistical nightmare that the history books gloss over. There were no roads in the panhandle. Every piece of timber for the tower, every iron casting for the gearbox, and every foot of pipe had to be hauled by ox wagon from the nearest railhead, often 100 miles away. The drilling rigs were steam-powered monsters that required coal and water to operate. Water that had to be hauled in barrels until the well was struck. The drillers were a different breed than the cowboys. They were technicians, charging $150 to $2 per foot of depth. A 300-foot well cost $600 just to drill, a fortune in 1885. But the XIT paid it, again and again. Here is the part that changes everything about how we view the timeline of settlement. We often think the railroad brought civilization, and then the settlers followed. But the steam locomotives of the Union Pacific and Santa Fe lines were thirsty beasts. A standard locomotive consumed up to 12,000 gallons of water every hour while under load. They couldn't cross the dry plains without refilling. It was the windmill that allowed the railroad to exist, not the other way round. In 1865, the Union Pacific placed orders for Halliday windmills to be installed at tank stops every 15 miles. The iron road literally followed the path of the wind pumps. The railroad engineers were the first to prove the technology worked at scale. The ranchers were actually late adopters, watching the trains refill for a decade before they fully committed to the technology. By the late 1880s, the system began to accelerate. The wooden wheels were prone to shrinking in the dry air, causing bolts to loosen and rattles to develop. In the winter, ice would coat the slats, throwing the wheel out of balance. In 1888, the Air Motor Company changed the game. They introduced a windmill made entirely of galvanized steel. But it wasn't just the material that changed, it was the math. The air motor engineers had studied the aerodynamics of the blade. They introduced a curved, mathematically precise steel blade that was 85% more efficient than flat wood. This wasn't just an upgrade, it was a quantum leap. A steel air motor could spin in a 4-mile-per-hour breeze, generating torque when the air barely moved. The wooden Halliday needed an 8-mile-per-hour wind to get started. In the blistering calms of July, that difference of 4 miles per hour was the difference between a full tank and a thirsty herd. The introduction of the steel mill coincided with the escalation of the fence-cutting wars. Traditional ranchers, who didn't own land but grazed their cattle on the open public domain, hated the windmills. The windmill facilitated fencing. It allowed a rancher to claim a specific tract of land, drill a well, fence it off, and sustain his herd exclusively. This destroyed the free-range economy. In 1883, bands of masked cowboys, calling themselves the Blue Devils or the Javelinas, rode out at night to cut barbed wire and burn windmill towers. They weren't just vandals. They were desperate men watching their economic model collapse. They realized that whoever controlled the pump controlled the land. But they were fighting a losing battle against efficiency. The windmill owners could stock more cattle, produce better beef, and survive droughts that wiped out the free-range herds. The ultimate test of this technology came during the environmental catastrophe known as the Big Die-Up. The winter of 1886 to 1887 was apocalyptic. Blizzards struck the plains with a ferocity that hadn't been seen in decades. The snow drifted 10 feet high. Cattle, driven by the storm, slammed into the new barbed wire fences, stacking up in frozen piles. But the ranchers with reliable deep wells and windmills noticed something distinct. While surface water, creeks and ponds, froze solid under 2 feet of ice, the water coming from 300 feet down was a constant 55 degrees. It didn't freeze in the tank if it was kept moving. The windmills, spinning in the blizzard's gale, pumped warm water onto the frozen landscape. The ranchers who survived the die-up were the ones who had invested in steel and gears. The cattle that could reach the tanks lived. The ones relying on frozen creeks died of thirst while standing on top of ice. This marked the end of the cattle baron era of gambling on the weather and the rise of the stockman era of managing a resource. However, complications arose from the very success of the machine. With water available anywhere, ranchers began to overstock the range. The grass, not the water, became the limiting factor. In 1889, reports from the Department of Agriculture noted that areas around windmill tanks were being trampled into dust bowls. The cattle would congregate at the water source, stripping the vegetation in widening circles. This was the first sign of the ecological cost of terraforming. The ranchers were altering the grazing patterns that had existed for thousands of years. Bison moved constantly. Cattle anchored by windmills stood still. The land began to degrade. Remember that telegram from the Hook? The useless toys comment. By 1890, the XIT Ranch had installed 335 windmills. Their ledgers show they were pumping enough water to sustain 150,000 head of cattle. Let's do the math on the labor replacement again, because the scale is staggering. If they had attempted to do this with manual labor, requiring one man for every 50 head to pump water, they would have needed a workforce of 3,000 men just for hydration. The cost of 3,000 men at $30 a month is $90,000 per month. That is over $1 million a year in 1890 currency. The maintenance cost of 335 windmills. The ledgers show they employed a windmill crew of just 12 men to ride the circuit, greasing gears and fixing leathers. The machine replaced 2,188 men. It turned a payroll liability into a fixed asset. This brings us to the hidden conflict of the era, the windmill wars. Not a shooting war, but a legal one. As deep wells proliferated, neighbors began to sue each other over the water table. In the East, water law was based on riparian rights. If you lived by the river, you owned the water. In the West, the windmill forced the creation of prior appropriation. First in time, first in right. But groundwater was a mystery. It was considered occult water by the courts, meaning hidden and unknowable. If neighbor A drilled a well and neighbor B's well went dry, there was no legal recourse. The courts ruled that groundwater was like a wild animal. It belonged to whoever captured it. This triggered a drilling race. Ranchers drilled deeper and deeper, installing larger mills to suck the aquifer dry before their neighbors could. It was a tragedy of the commons played out with piston pumps. The climax of this technological revolution arrived with the drought of the early 1890s. This was the test that would determine if the American settlement of the West was permanent or a temporary excursion. In 1892, rain ceased across much of Kansas, Nebraska, and the Texas Panhandle. The sky turned a bruised yellow. Homesteaders who relied on rain-fed crops watched their corn wither and turn to dust. Thousands packed up their wagons to head back east, defeated. The roads were clogged with families painting, "In God We Trusted, in Kansas We Busted," on their canvas covers. But the ranchers and farmers with deep-bore windmills stayed. On the King. Ranch in Texas, the drought was severe, yet the cattle count held steady. The windmills were pumping from the deep aquifer, completely bypassing the meteorological drought on the surface. This is the moment where the myth of the rugged individual falls apart. The survival of these settlements wasn't due to grit, prayer, or determination. It was due to access to the water table via a gear reduction box. The farmers who had listened to the skeptics and saved their money by not buying a windmill lost their farms. The ones who had gone into debt to buy an air motor kept their land. Let's look at the specific output data from a 10-foot air motor installed in 1892 to understand the physics of this survival. In a 15-mile-per-hour wind, the mill generated only about 0.36 horsepower. It doesn't sound like much. A horse generates, obviously, 1 horsepower. But the difference is stamina. A horse can work hard for maybe 6 hours. The windmill worked for 24 hours. Over a full day, that fractional horsepower lifted 12,000 gallons of water. To replicate that work with horses, you would need a team rotating in shifts, consuming grain, requiring handlers, and needing rest. The windmill transformed the kinetic energy of the wind, a free, infinite resource, into the potential energy of water in a tank. It was the most efficient energy conversion system of the 19th century, and it required 0 fuel. The immediate aftermath of the drought solidified the windmill's dominance. By 1900, there were an estimated 6 million windmills spinning in the United States. They became the visual signature of the West. You could navigate by them. They were the lighthouses of the prairie, but their ubiquity made them invisible to history. We look at old photos and see the cowboy, the horse, and the gun. We ignore the tower in the background that kept them all alive. The manufacturers of these machines, Air Motor, Eclipse, Dempster, Challenge, became the industrial titans of the era, yet their names are largely forgotten compared to Colt or Winchester. When we analyze the drivers of this history, we see a clear pattern. Technology acts as a force multiplier for capital. The windmill allowed Eastern and British capital to extract value from land that was theoretically worthless. It turned the Great American Desert, as it was labeled on maps in the 1820s, into the breadbasket and meat locker of the world. The conventional story says the West was tamed by lawmen suppressing outlaws. The evidence suggests the West was tamed by engineers suppressing the climate. The outlaw threat was statistically negligible compared to the threat of dehydration. A rancher was far more likely to be wiped out by a dry well than by a cattle rustler. However, this victory over nature was not without consequences. The pumps were so efficient that they began the slow, invisible draining of the Ogallala aquifer. We are still paying the price for that efficiency today. The windmill didn't just solve a problem. It created a dependency. The entire agricultural economy of the plains was built on the assumption that the water would never stop flowing. The windmill allowed humans to bypass the natural carrying capacity of the land. It allowed us to pretend that the desert wasn't a desert. This reveals a hidden truth about the Wild West. It wasn't wild. It was an industrial zone. The cowboy was a low-level employee in a highly mechanized outdoor factory. He wasn't riding the open range. He was riding the gaps between the windmills. His job wasn't to adventure. It was to inspect seals and check oil levels in gearboxes. The myth requires us to believe in the triumph of the human spirit against the elements. The reality is the triumph of the centrifugal governor and the check valve. By 1930, rural electrification began to replace the wind pumps with electric motors. The spinning blades that had defined the horizon for 50 years began to rust and stop. But the legacy remains. The 3 million acres of the XIT were eventually broken up and sold, becoming thousands of farms and smaller ranches, all viable only because of the wells drilled in the 1880s. The water rights established during the Windmill Wars still form the basis of Western property law today. Remember the image of the thirsty herd from the beginning. Today, if you drive through the Texas Panhandle, you will still see cattle grazing on that same scrub brush. And if you look closely, past the power lines and the massive center pivot irrigators that suck thousands of gallons a minute, you will occasionally see a rusted air motor skeleton standing guard. It is a monument to the machine that did the work of 6 million men. It is a testament to a time when the wind was the only thing standing between civilization and the desert. The West wasn't won with blood. It was won with water. And the key to that victory was a simple, creaking wheel that turned useless toys into the engine of an empire.